we scheduled this, we had no idea months and months ago that the Pittsburgh Pirates would be in a pennant race. So let's enjoy it, but at the same time, let me thank you for taking time out of rooting for the Pirates. Hopefully they'll do well against the San Diego Padres this evening and continue their chase. But it has been a very exciting summer, and I think it's just in time because the Pittsburgh Steelers, in case you don't know it, aren't off to the best start. Someone said the other night that they lost 5 of their last 7 last year, and then they lost the first 6 this year. So the thing is, that's what sports is about. You don't know. So many people think that the Super Bowl is on the Steelers' schedule. You know, they start the season talking about what do you think their chances are in the Super Bowl. And I'm going to be talking tonight, and I already have been asked some interesting questions from people that have come in. So I'm going to have a Q&A session so that you have a chance to hit me with some questions. My name is James Patrick Joseph O'Brien. And Mr. Levine, in case you didn't realize it, I'm Irish. I'm also a storyteller. And if you're familiar with Irish storytellers, first of all, everybody who's Irish thinks they are a good storyteller. Well, we have a unique way of telling stories, and you'll have to bear with me and keep in mind that I am an Irish storyteller. And what that means is that I may start off telling you about something, and I'll go round and round, and eventually I will get back to what it was that I started to tell you about. So you just have to hang on for the ride and make sure that you're with me. I'm going to tell you some stories. I'm going to offer some insights and tell you about some behind-the-scenes stuff. And for starters, let me tell you this. This building, this Bethel Park Recreation Center, is really a community treasure. I live in neighboring Upper St. Clair, but I want you to know that my wife and I and some of our friends have utilized this building for the past year and a half. We walk the track. We play a game called pickleball that we just started to play a year and a half ago. And I can tell you this, that we're not only playing a new sport and exercising, but we have made friends. We have about 20-some new friends that we did not have a year and a half ago. And that's good for the soul, too. That's good for your health to make new friends. So the Bethel Park Recreation Center affords a lot of opportunities to you in the community, and this program that they're initiating right now with this speaker series, it's going to be a plus. And I know that Cyril Wecht, I believe, is already lined up to be one of the speakers. He and I spoke one time out in Lower Borough on the same program. And I really felt like I was back in high school, as if I were in a forensic competition, because the competitor in me wanted to do a better speaking job than Dr. Cyril Wecht. Now, I can see that he has been involved in some very high-profile and controversial and intriguing deaths, murders, you name it. I mean, he has been involved with so much. And he has a vocabulary. See, I have a pretty good vocabulary, but I try to connect with my audience, so I don't use the whole vocabulary. Dr. Wecht never heard a word that he hasn't tried to use, and he uses it properly, so more credit to him. I'm going to tell you something for starters, and there's only one person that I see in the audience that might know the answer. But what athlete from Western Pennsylvania has made more money than any other athlete from Western Pennsylvania in his performance? We're not talking about commercials or selling cars or advertisements or anything else, but what athlete has made the most money over the past 20 years? Anyone? No, Arnie Palmer in the last 20 years, I just said, most of his income has come from designing golf courses, from advertisements and everything else. But I'm sure that Arnie Palmer has made more money than God over the last 20 years. But it's not Arnold Palmer. Anyone? It's someone from your backyard. Yes, sir. Armin Gilliam. Perhaps the least recognized and least known outstanding professional athlete from this city, perhaps in our history. He and Roger Kingdom. Roger Kingdom actually is from Georgia, but went to the University of Pittsburgh and lived in Monroeville most of his adult life, and continues as a coach at California University of Pennsylvania. But Armand Gilliam from Bethel Park, who didn't even make his high school basketball team as a starter, was on the wrestling team and went to a junior college and then went to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where he was an All-American. But get this, he made, in 14 years of professional basketball, $84 million. That helped carry things a good way at the Shiloh Baptist Church in South Park, where his father, the Reverend James T. Gilliam, held forth for so many years. I'm old enough at 71 that I saw his father in action. I don't know if any of you recognize or knew James T. Gilliam. Both of those gentlemen have passed away in the last 2 years. Armin was just in his early 40s when he died of an enlarged heart playing basketball at the LA Fitness down in Collier Township. And his father passed away about a year later. His father was one of the first athletes that I ever wrote about. His father was a member of the Glen Hazel Boys Club boxing team in our community. I grew up in Glenwood, which is next door to Hazelwood. Sometimes people think that I'm from Hazelwood, but if I told you I was from Hazelwood, I would be guilty of social climbing, and I'm actually from Glenwood. But the Glen Hazel Boys Club was the best boxing team in the city of Pittsburgh when I was a kid. They won 12 team boxing championships in a 13-year period. It was through that Golden Gloves that I also first met Myron Cope. I was 14 years old. I was in the Pitt Field House. I was the sports editor of the Hazelwood Envoy. That means I've been a professional, getting paid, not a lot, but I was paid at the age of 14 to write for the local paper. But I went up to Mr. Cope in the locker room, and he was carrying a typewriter, small typewriter, and he was scurrying about as only Myron can scurry about. And he went by me, and I said, "Mr. Cope." And he said, "Yeah, kid." I said, "What do I have to do to become a writer?" He looked down at me and he said, "Kid, you gotta sit down and start writing." Believe it or not, I can still hear Myron every year after the first of the year when I have to contemplate and get to work on doing a new book. Because a lot of people talk about doing a book, or I'm going to write a book, or my friends tell me I should write a book, but I've actually written 25 books, 22 on achievement in the city of Pittsburgh. But every year I can hear Myron, as only Myron can put it, "Kid, you gotta sit down and start writing." And that's the truth. You do have to sit down. It doesn't happen on its own. You have to sit down. I went to a funeral in Hazelwood about a year or so ago. A fellow who was a boxer died. And when I went in there, they had scrapbooks. And what was pleasing to me was that on one side of the page would be a story by Myron Cope, because the Golden Gloves was his baby in those days. It was like the Super Bowl for him. And it was for me, certainly, as the sports editor of the Hazelwood Envoy. That was our big deal, the Golden Gloves. And on the other side of the page, facing Myron Cope's columns, were columns by Jim O'Brien. And I felt that that was a real honor. In that particular funeral home, by the way, the David O'Connor Funeral Home, he has a glass case in the corner of his office in which he has all of my books. He shows my books to everybody who comes to the funeral home. And the thing about it is, David got divorced about 10 years ago, and I don't know why, but his wife took all the books. It was good for me. He had to buy a new set, and I obliged him. But that's sort of my Hall of Fame in Hazelwood. It's at the O'Connor Funeral Home. I write about sports history in Pittsburgh and western Pennsylvania. I write human interest stories. I'm much more interested in people than I am in the ball games, the scores, and certainly the statistics. Speaking of statistics, the next time you're listening to a Pirates broadcast or a telecast, every time the announcers say something about statistics, that you realize that were not available to Bob Prince when he was doing the Pirates games, check it off. See how many checks you have at the end of the broadcast. Such as, this was the 11th time on the second pitch of the game that he threw a curveball in which it was hit to the right field. I mean, they have stats on everything today. I told you I was 71. I turned 71 in August. My wife Kathy and I, she said to say hello, Laverne. Laverne's a friend of her family. I celebrated anyhow, our 46th wedding anniversary. And the thing about Kathy is she has kept me on course. I dedicated my new book about Chuck Noll to Kathy because I feel that she had the same role as Mary Ann Noll, and that is she kept us stable. In my case, she kept me out of jail, and I've always been grateful for her direction in that regard, although sometimes she does tend to overdo it in the direction category. I was out in the front yard of my home about a year ago. I was doing something I had promised Kathy I would do. I had promised her I would do it maybe 3 years earlier, and I didn't even realize what I was doing. I thought I was thatching the lawn, but I read in a landscape book that what I was doing was dethatching the lawn. Whatever I was doing wasn't easy, and it took a lot of effort. So I'm dethatching the lawn, and a man pulls up in a car and stops and gets out and introduces himself to me. He says, "Do you remember me?" And I said, "You look familiar." He said, "I'm Barry Foley's son." He said, "My dad was the last groundskeeper at Three Rivers Stadium." He said, "You wrote about my dad. You had a chapter on him in your book about Art Rooney, the chief." He said, "I'm stopping because my dad died last week, and I wanted to tell you that." He said, "But I also wanted to tell you that my dad liked that chapter so much and was so proud of it that when he was laid out at the funeral home, your book was in the casket. And we buried my dad with your book in the casket." So at that moment, my wife appeared in the doorway. Somehow, she sensed that I had paused in my work effort. Don't ask me how she does it, but she knew. And she said, "What's going on down there?" And I said, "Oh, this fellow just stopped. After 46 years, I'm still trying to impress her." And I told her the story. I said, he said his dad was so fond of the story that they put my book in his casket. I said, "Honey, that's at least the 6th casket I know of that my book's been in when it was put into the ground." Still trying to impress her. She said, "Well, I'll tell you someone else's casket your books are going to be in. When you go, all that stuff in the garage is going with you." Oh, boy. I tell you, I came home one day on the 3rd. Tomorrow's Thursday. It's a big day in our house. It's garbage day. And it's not the most exciting Thursday of the month. Next week is recyclable day. That's a little bigger. But when Kathy was working as a social worker for 17 years at Allegheny General Hospital, she would always leave on Wednesday and say, "Make sure that you take the garbage out." But this one Thursday, I come, and they are at the bottom of the driveway are all these boxes. And I look in them, and all my Little League trophies, my Pony League trophies, my hit and miss bowling league trophies, my CYO basketball, all the trophies are in the box at the bottom of the driveway. And I said, "How can you do this to me?" She said, "Get some new stuff." Talk about encouragement or pushing, You had to go out and get some new plaques, some new awards, and so forth. That's what I do. I'm still trying to impress her. I'm going to tell you a story about Art Rooney. He's one of my favorites, all-time favorites, maybe number one. Very often, I'll ask myself when confronted with a decision, what would Art Rooney do? What would he do? And it serves me well. But this story about Art Rooney is my favorite story. I have a friend named Dan Lackner. He's the father of Rich Lackner, the football coach at Carnegie Mellon University. And his wife is Lois. She's from Hazelwood. And Dan had two brothers who were priests in Pittsburgh. One of them was Paul, who was with the Holy Name Society, and the other one was Father, Paul, and I can't think of the other one off the top of my head. Very big guy, was at St. Margaret of Scotland in Greentree. And Dan Lackner was telling me that when he was a young man, he worked for the Rooneys when they had their offices at the Fort Pitt Hotel. He said he would get out of Central Catholic early along with another student who would get out early, a fellow named Reed Cordick. Reed Cordick would get down to, he was an intern at KDKA, and Dan Lackner helped out at the Steelers offices. He was an intern, just like this young man here introduced himself as an intern. And so he goes way back with the Rooneys. So Mrs. Rooney dies, Kathleen Rooney. And she's at Devlin Funeral Home on the north side of Pittsburgh. And one of the things that Art Rooney taught me was, he said, you got to go to the funerals. He went to more funerals than anybody in the city of Pittsburgh. And in fact, when he would go to the funeral, he would go in, and even if he didn't know the other people, he'd go into the other rooms, show his face, and walk around and comfort people. And when he'd leave, he'd say to his friend, how do they know me? How do they know me? That's how humble he was. He was also Irish, and the Irish love funerals. You see the obits in the paper, the obituary section? That's called the Irish Sports page. So Dan Lackner goes to the funeral of Kathleen Rooney, and he walks into the lobby of the funeral home on the north side, and as soon as he comes to the door, someone goes, psst, psst, hey, Dan. And he looks over and he faintly recognizes the guy, but he's not sure, and the guy calls him over, and he says, Joe McNamara, we went to Central Catholic together. Oh, what are you doing here, Joe? He says, oh, my dad's in the back room. He said, my dad died the other day. He said, didn't know what to do. All my dad's friends are gone. My mom's been gone for quite a while. He said, we're only going to be here for one day. He said, what's your dad do? He said, oh, he's a fireman. He said, we lived out on Dawson Street in Oakland. He said, my dad worked for the Pittsburgh Fire Department. And Dan Lackner said, well, let's go back. Let me pay my respects. So he goes back, and he said the room was bare. He said there was a casket, a body, a kneeler, a podium like this to sign in, one basket of flowers. He said it looked odd. He said a little prayer, signed his name, and walked back into the lobby of Devlin Funeral Home. And when he walked into the lobby, Art Rooney spotted him. And Art Rooney said to him, what are you doing back there? He said, oh, a high school friend of mine, Joe McNamara, his dad died. He's in the back room. And Mr. Rooney said, well, let's go back and pay our respects. So the two of them went back. Art Rooney shook the man's hand, the young man's hand, and signed his name, said a prayer, came back to the lobby. So he's in the lobby, and through the front door comes a tall black gentleman holding his arms outstretched, two baskets of flowers here, two baskets of flowers there. And Mr. Rooney says to him, where are you going with those flowers? They're for Mrs. Rooney. Mr. Rooney said, Mrs. Rooney has enough flowers. You take these flowers into the back room for our friend McNamara. And the man follows his direction. So now Art Rooney turns, and who's in the front door of the funeral home? But two of Pittsburgh's leading political figures. It's Pete Flaherty, the mayor of Pittsburgh, and it's Tom Forster, the Allegheny County commissioner, both natives of the north side, both longtime friends of the Rooney family. They both approached Mr. Rooney. We're sorry, Art, about Kathleen. He says, yeah. He said, listen, he said, while you're here, you be sure to go back and say a prayer for our friend McNamara. Well, Forster looks at Flaherty, like, who's he talking about? And Mr. Rooney almost indignantly says, McNamara, the fireman from Oakland, for God's sake, Dawson Street. Oh, that one. So they go back, they pay their respects, and they come back. My friend Dan Lackner comes back to the funeral the second day. I told you the Irish like funerals. He's back a second day. He walks in. Psst, psst, hey. He looks over. There's his friend McNamara. He walks over. He said, I thought you were going to leave. I thought you were only here for one day. Come on back. He said, I went in the back room. I walked in. He said, the room looked like Phipps Conservatory. He said, I went over to the sign-in sheet. I looked at it. Pete Rozelle, commissioner of the NFL. Rocky Bleier, Mel Blount, Terry Bradshaw, Sam Nover, Bill Hillgrove, Myron Cope. Everybody who came to the Rooney funeral had to go back and pay their respects to McNamara. And that tells you everything you need to know about Art Rooney and why he was such a special man. The day he died, I was at St. Peter's Church on the north side, and two things stick out in my mind. One, I was sitting behind Frank Thomas, the former Pirate slugger. And he had a daughter die in a very tragic accident. She actually fell down an elevator shaft at a holiday season party. Didn't realize that the elevator had stopped between floors and she fell out. He said that when they had that funeral, it was in the winter. He said Art Rooney stood in a line about a block away from the funeral home in the snow, waiting for his turn to get into the funeral home. But he said he wouldn't go ahead of the line or break the line. And then I'm sitting there in the church, and I look over to my left, and I could see this coming. Sitting directly behind each other in pews were Pete Rozelle and Al Davis, who at the time were enemies and always at each other's throats. So I knew what was coming, and that was that when you had to turn and shake hands and offer a blessing, and we just felt that Art Rooney was up there with strings, playing some games to make sure that those guys would get together. But he was special for sure. And a fellow from the New York Giants, George Young, who was at the church that day, there were so many priests. George Young said, it would not be a good day for a Catholic to die in Pittsburgh because they would never get the last rites because all the priests were at St. Peter's at Art Rooney's funeral. Some in the organization had suggested that they take the funeral because of his stature in the community to the Bishop's Church, the St. Paul's Cathedral. But someone who knew Art Rooney better than they did said, if you do, Art Rooney won't come. He wants it at his church, St. Peter's. I'll tell you about another person who has a strong spiritual bent and one of my favorite Pittsburgh Steelers today, Troy Polamalu. Okay? I went up to St. Vincent's once to interview him, and I didn't know how I was going to see him because the PR people these days think their job is to keep you away from the players. And there's all these roadblocks that they set up at St. Vincent's for the fans as well as the media. So many ropes, so many directions, so many rules. And I'm walking to the cafeteria, and I look to my left, and who's walking alongside of me? Somebody I'd never met in my life, Troy Polamalu. I introduced myself to him and said, I was wondering if I could talk to you after lunch. He said, why don't we do it now? So we went off into a little grotto. I actually hid him so no one knew that I was with him. And we talked, and after a while I said, don't you think you better get to lunch? He said, no, we'll do this. This is fine. He was so nice. I remember when I got home that day, I said to Kathy, he almost seems too sweet to be a ball player, to be a football player. He loves St. Vincent because of its spiritual aspects, because of the presence of the priests and the brothers and the nuns and so forth. That was the only time I ever saw him that year, at the beginning of the year. And about 4 or 5 months later, I was at Monroeville Mall and I was signing books. And he came by with his girlfriend at the time, now his wife. And he came over and he introduced his girlfriend to me. And you have no idea how rare that is for a ball player to actually acknowledge the presence of a woman in his company. They just don't do it. It's almost as if they're not there. Everything's about them so often. But not with Troy Polamalu. We introduced her. And then about 15 minutes later, I looked up from signing, and I look across the hall. He's on the other side of the mall, and he waves to me like we're old friends. 10 minutes later, I'm sitting there, and I look up, and he's putting a steaming Cinnabon in front of me. And he just put it there and smiled and walked away. How can you not love a guy like that? A year ago, Kathy and I were at Ross Park Mall. We were at California Pizza Kitchen. It's one of our favorite restaurants. There is a California Pizza Kitchen in Pittsburgh. It's at Ross Park. Our daughter, Rebecca, is a managing partner at a California Pizza Kitchen out in California. So we're sitting there, and I see this family where the mother, the husband, and the little boy are all wearing Troy Polamalu shirts, number 43. And my wife has to put up with this all the time. I said, excuse me, I got to go over and talk to these people. So I go over and I introduce myself. And I said, why do you like Troy Polamalu so much? And the guy said, I shouldn't. I went to UCLA, and he went to USC. We were rivals, but I still like him. And I thought the woman said that she was a psychologist. And I said, what does that have to do with you liking Troy Polamalu? She said, no, I'm a pediatric oncologist, hematologist. She said, you're Sarah O'Brien's dad, aren't you? And I said, yes. And my daughter is in that same specialty, Sarah. And she said, she was so nice to me when I was in training. And the one thing I can tell you is, as a father, you never get tired of getting good reports about your kids. Never. So I like that. And she said to me, I'll tell you why I like Troy Polamalu. She said, I'm at Children's Hospital in the Cancer Center in Oakland. She said, every Friday, Troy Polamalu comes to our ward. He brings a guitar, he sings to the children, and he reads books to them. Every Friday. And she said he doesn't want any publicity about it. And she said he got close to some of those kids, and he and his wife had them over to their home for dinner and so forth. So a couple weeks later, armed with this ammunition, I ran into somebody that my wife had introduced me to, a woman named Tina Masseri, who is involved with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society of Pittsburgh. And I told her my story. And she said, Jim, I'll tell you something else about that. You know those children he got close to? Some of those kids didn't make it. She said, Troy Polamalu paid for their funerals. Okay? I just heard the other day on TV that a group from Westinghouse, a choral group, wanted to go and perform in Prague. And they came up about $4,300 short of what they needed. And that Andrew McCutcheon came through along with Pirate Charities to fill the void. And then Andrew had them come out to a ball game and perform. And I saw that the Pirates were some other school this week in Pittsburgh. That's what they should do. When you have that ability, when you can attract people, you should do that. You know, anyone in Pittsburgh who's over 60 years old, we don't have anybody here in that category, but anybody over 60 still remembers where they were when Maz hit the home run. I was the only one in Pittsburgh who wasn't at Forbes Field that day. I was across the street at the Pitt Student Union watching the game on television. Maz is one of my favorites. I like to write about him because I think most Pittsburghers like their sports heroes to be humble. And I think we've had that in Mario Lemieux. I think we've had that with somebody who showed that they could help in the community, such as Roberto Clemente, and certainly we have that with Maz. I had visited Maz and his wife, Mylene, about 10 years ago at their home out in Greensburg. And it was cold that day. It was cold and it rained and it was dank. And when I got to the house, Maz and Mylene were sitting on the porch in sweaters to make sure that I didn't miss the house. Okay? Somehow I can't picture Barry Bonds doing that someday to make sure I don't miss the house. And they were sitting out there with their dog, and their dog, aptly enough, was named Muttley. So Muttley, Maz, and Mylene were all there. When I went into the house, I had been there 20 years earlier, and I remarked to Mylene that I recognized the doilies that were on the back of the couch and on the armrest. And she sort of looked at them and she said, I'm sure they're the same doilies as when you were here the last time. And I kept Mylene with me because Bill was reluctant to talk about himself or to share his stories. And Mylene knows his stories, so she prompts him. And that really helps because she gets him to tell the best stories. I was in Cooperstown the day that Maz got into the Hall of Fame. I had been in Canton the day before to see Lynn Swann go into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and then my buddies and I jumped in a car and took off for Cooperstown, New York. And you may remember Maz had this talk all written out that he was prepared to do, and he just broke down when he got up there because he couldn't believe that he was getting into the Hall of Fame, and he spoke for about 2 sentences and then said, to hell with it. I'm not going to do it. You know, one of the nice things about the people that I saw here this evening is some people that go back to with my family and with my kids and with my in-laws and so forth. And that's always a source of reinforcement because I have benefited by the company I've kept as an adult with my wife, with my kids. And I am so proud of them. I have a new book out. It's the first book that's ever been done on Chuck Noll. And more so than ever before, I feel like my fingerprints are on every page because I was able, technology keeps changing, I was able to tell the typesetter, I want this picture here, I want this picture there. This book has 460 photographs. And it has color photographs showing the Steelers then and now. And when I started to do it, Chuck Noll's not doing interviews these days because he's 81, he'll be 82 in January, and he's not well. He has persistent back problems that require him to use 2 canes when he does walk. Doesn't get around much anymore. He also has short memory loss. But you know what? So do I. You don't ever walk into a room in your house and forget what you came for, do you? Do you ever drive out of the garage and drive to the post office because you usually do when you're supposed to be going to the South Hills Village? So I can relate to that a little bit. But this book I really enjoyed doing because this is a decent man and you can learn so much from him. And I didn't realize until I started to work on it how many in-depth interviews I had enjoyed with him. 3 and 4 hours in his home in Upper St. Clair where he lived for 25 years. In his home in Swickley where he still keeps an apartment. In his office at St. Vincent College. In his office at Three Rivers Stadium. And I interviewed all the players. I had a day this year, you know, I have people come up to me sometimes and say, I wish I would have seen what you've seen. Or can't you take me with you? And that's what I try to do in my books. I try to take you with me. I think I started out that way, wanting to take my boyhood friends with me to meet the people I've been fortunate to meet and spend time with them, hear what they have to say. What I try to do as a writer is I tell you who I'm talking to, where I talk to them, what they had to say, what I learned from it, what it made me think about. And I write as if I'm writing a letter to my best friend. I'm telling you all these things. I liked a lot of things about Chuck Noll. He was an expert on raising children. He had 1 child. Someone commented, Dan Rooney has 9 kids and he never offers an opinion about how to raise kids, and Chuck Noll has 1, and he's an expert on the subject. But Chuck fancied himself an expert on wine and good food, gourmet food, and so forth. But he also taught. He was a teacher. Miss Yerkes, that's something I think of myself as. I know you were a teacher. You taught my Rebecca. I think of myself as a teacher. I'm a teacher disguised as a sports writer. But everything I write has a meaning. Every story is meant to teach. What can we learn from these people? I'm always amazed why when people have a choice between being a good guy or a good gal or being a jerk. They choose to be a jerk. The other day, for instance, I was going to a luncheon to speak to the Westmoreland County Chamber of Commerce. And I was on Route 22, somewhere in past Murraysville, and I just kept going and going and going. And finally I thought maybe I was lost. So at a red light, I asked the guy in the next car, I said, "Where's 119? He said, "It's about 5 or 7 miles ahead." He said, "Why don't you follow me? I'll take you there." I followed him. He said, "I'll give you a hand signal when you get off." Well, I get there. He doesn't give me a hand signal. He pulls off. And he pulls into a lot, and he wants to give me the specific details of how to get to the place. And I said to him, you have done so much more than I expected." And when I got to the luncheon, I said, that's what we should all do. We should all give people more than they expect from us. We should try to do that. I used to spend a lot of time at South Hills Village in the mall signing books. I told Mrs. Yerkes here earlier, I said, and she was aware of it, I said, your husband used to stop all the time and go and get me something to drink. Dick Kraft is here. He would do it on occasion. Can I get you something to drink? And you appreciate that because you can't leave on your own, but it's nice to have people do nice things. I'll tell you something else. We're talking about the Pirates now and the Steelers and so forth. On Monday morning at our local Kings, I hear all these experts sitting around complaining about the Steelers. They didn't give it their best effort. They didn't do this. Roonies are cheap. Pirates can't win. And I say this. Don't rely on the Pirates and the Steelers and the Penguins to make your day. Don't rely on them to make your weekend. And certainly, and this is true in some cases, don't rely on them to make your life. They can't make you a winner. You have to do that. And I tell these guys, what are you going to do this week? Whether you're a school teacher, a salesperson, a mother, a father, a husband, a wife, what are you going to do this week to be the best you can be? What's your game plan? What's your strategy? Are you going to be a winner? And I think it's much more. If I come here to play pickleball or basketball or even to walk the track, whatever it is, that's my competition. I wanted to get this book out. Somebody else was brought into town. You probably might have read about it in the paper. They brought someone in from St. Louis to write a book about Chuck Noll. I've been working on this, and I said, I've actually talked to the man. I've actually been around those Steelers of the 70s. It's my book. So I responded to that competition, and I got it done. And one of the things that helped me was Myron Cope's voice in the back of my head. Kid, you gotta sit down and start writing. And that's what I did. And that's how I got my 25th book done. And tonight when I walked in here, some people asked me some questions, and they were so eager. Are you going to have a Q&A? So let's have a Q&A. Does this mic here work if somebody wants to ask a question so that everybody can hear it? Is this mic on? Yeah. Okay, if you want to ask a question, or maybe if you have a loud voice, just sound it out. Put your hand up, and yes, sir.
So Ryan read all your books, your excellent author, Joy Allen. I wanted to ask you sort of an unorthodox question. Who are your least favorite Pittsburgh athletes?
My least favorites. Well, I can actually say, the other day I ran into Ron Jay at the Giant Eagle. Do you remember Ron Jay? He's 76 now. He's had 2 heart procedures. We just bumped into each other. We sat down and we had lunch. We talked about it. And one of the things I said to him was, it's been my experience that most of the people that I've met in the television and radio in Pittsburgh through the years, 95% of them are really, really nice people. Patrice King Brown, who might be the most beautiful woman in Pittsburgh ever, such a good person. John Burnett, Patty Burns, Eleanor Shano. Eleanor's still out there trucking. We talk to each other. I give her pep talks. So many nice people, and most of the athletes were nice people. But I'd say, just top of my head, I told you Cordell Stewart, and you volunteered Greg Lloyd. Cordell Stewart, one day I walked up to Cordell Stewart in the locker room, and I wasn't covering the team at the time, but I was writing books about the Steelers. And I walked up to him on a Tuesday, and I introduced myself to him, and I said, Cordell, I'm Jim O'Brien. I'm working on a book about the Steelers, and I would like to talk to you. And he looked at me like I was a fly on his pie, and he said, don't you know what day it is? And I was taken off guard, not used to that response. And I said, I'm not sure what you mean. He said, I only do interviews on Wednesday. And I told you I was from Glenwood, so I'm a bit of a smart ass. I pulled out my pen and my pad, and I said, let me have that again. I only do interviews on Wednesday. I said, that's a good quote. I said, I never got that quote from Joe Green. Never got that quote from Terry Bradshaw. Never got that quote from Franco Harris. Never got that quote from Dr. J. Never got that quote from Muhammad Ali. Never got that quote from Joe DiMaggio. Never got that quote from Joe Louis. And at that point, the team's equipment guy, Tony Parisi, pulled me away in a mock dramatic gesture, like as if we were wrestling. And he pulls me away and he says, for God's sake, Jim, leave him alone. Besides, he has no idea who you're talking about. And the other gentleman, I use that term loosely, Greg Lloyd, I don't get it. There's another guy who, was an outstanding football player, but a first-class jerk. And I don't understand that. He was rude and indifferent with most of the media, and then I heard a story about him where in order to get his son's attention about his schoolwork, he actually stuck a gun in his mouth. Okay? There's the big linebacker from the Steelers, putting a gun in his son's mouth to make a point. So about 2 years ago, I was at some function involving Steelers alumni, and someone said to me, why don't you go over and talk to Greg Lloyd? And I said, I don't want to talk to Greg Lloyd. And he said, oh, he's different now. And I said, it's too late. It's too late. I don't need to talk to Greg Lloyd. They once said of a ball player in the major leagues, they said he'd never learn to say hello until it was time to say goodbye. And that was certainly the case. But Art Rooney made up for all of those people. And if you ask Art Rooney that question, he would be stumped for an answer, because there wasn't anybody he didn't like. Yes, sir. Yes, Rich.
Where's Barry Bonds on your list of jerks?
I'm sorry. Barry Bonds. I never really dealt with Barry Bonds on a one-to-one basis. I wasn't covering the Pirates at that time. But think about this. Barry Bonds, before his head blew up, Barry Bonds was an attractive guy, was a handsome guy, and he was articulate. And I saw him at his best doing interviews and so forth. He could be downright charming. So why wasn't he that way all the time? And he was one of the greatest baseball players we've ever had in Pittsburgh. Someone asked me a question the other day. I vote for the Baseball Hall of Fame. And in the last ballot, I voted for several people that I wasn't crazy about, but I still believe that they belong. They're on the ballot. That means they're eligible. And in most of the cases, the steroids that were not banned in baseball when they were performing. They are now, since then. But I voted for Barry Bonds, I voted for Roger Clemens, and I voted for Sammy Sosa, and I voted for Mark McGwire. And if he'd been on the ballot, but he's not eligible, I would have voted for Pete Rose. But they're not on there. But he's in my Hall of Fame, Rich, for jerks. Yes.
Jim, I'm not like Chuck. I've only read one of your books, and I apologize for that. But I wasn't going to ask you a different question, but you just brought up the Baseball Hall of Fame. And I know there's a big stink about Dale Murphy not being in the Hall of Fame or not getting. Do you have an opinion on that at all?
I vote for Dale Murphy. I think he belongs. The Hall of Fame, I'll give you something. What do you know about Bill Buckner? Ball went through his legs. When he was playing for the Boston Red Sox, sixth game, Mookie Wilson against the New York Mets, sixth game, the ball dribbles through his legs. And one author wrote a story, which I love this. He said, the ball dribbled through his legs and into the first paragraph of his obituary. Think about that. That'll be in his obituary. Do you know that he played 24 seasons of Major League Baseball? Do you know that Bill Buckner had 500 more hits than Joe DiMaggio? Joe DiMaggio is thought of as one of the classic hitters of all time, one of the greatest baseball players ever. Bill Buckner has 500 more hits. But what's he remembered for? An error. What will Joe Paterno be remembered for? Most of his career, he did the right thing. The lesson for kids is you cannot afford a misstep, especially today. Today, everybody is a member of the media. Today, everybody has a camera. Everybody has a microphone. So you have to be on your toes at all times. Yes, sir.
Jim, first I want to thank you for the compliment you gave me about my father, who was a friend of yours. I do appreciate that. You do tell a lot of nice stories, and I've only read about 11 of your books. I'm going to work at it if you're prolific on it. I want to talk about Chuck Noll. In this day and age,
His dad was a referee, and he walked around like a referee even when he wasn't reffing. You always thought he had a whistle, right?
yes, well, since you're bringing him up, coaches would call him house. George Couples, as you know, is a stadium.
Yes.
I'd answer the phone when I was a shy young man, and I didn't talk much, so I said, Dad, George Couples is on the phone, wants to talk to you. And it was always for a championship game in City League basketball. And now when people tell me, I'm going to George Couples Stadium, that just rings true. And that's how all of us that are tied with sports, it's also life lessons that you're teaching us today.
I think your father was at the funeral when Fred Yee passed away, the Shenley High School basketball coach. Fred Yee was Jeremy Lin before Jeremy Lin. He's the only Chinese American ever to win a letter in basketball at Pitt, and he later coached City League, especially at Shenley High School and so forth. So a fellow who was a contemporary of your father, Paul Tomasevich, another classic character in Pittsburgh sports.
I didn't mean to direct it around the basketball, but
Yeah.
that's his wheelhouse.
Yeah, Paul Tomasevich had 7 daughters, and he's a basketball referee, and he was the Babe Ruth of softball, slow, fast-pitch softball, Paul Tomasevich. But he was telling me a story. That's the great. You can really get a lot of stories when you go to funerals, because people are always emotionally on edge, and they're thinking, and they want to reminisce about things. And he told me a story about this basketball game he was doing with Shenley High School. And he heard the huddle toward the end of the game where Paul Yee said to his players, I want the ball in the hands of Lewis. You get the ball to Lewis. Lewis, I don't want you to shoot until there's 3 seconds to go on the clock, and then you shoot, okay? So they bring the ball in. Sonny Lewis gets the ball and immediately shoots. Immediately. And he said that as he was running past Paul Yee on the bench, Tomasevich said that Paul Yee said to him, was I speaking in Chinese? But you get those kind of stories. And one of the stories in my book about Chuck Noll was when I was at Ray Mansfield's funeral service at Westminster Presbyterian Church. I was sitting on the aisle, and all of a sudden I felt a hand on my shoulder, and it was Chuck Noll. And he just put his hand, that was it. I knew better than to ask him any questions or something. We were in church. But just that, the day that he retired from the Steelers, he lived 1.5 miles from me. And in between us was Myron Cope. So that was an interesting parlay. But Chuck Noll, when he retired, said to me as he walked in the room, he put his hand on my shoulder again, and he said, how are you doing, neighbor? And I feel like I wrote this book. I mention about his current challenges. But Chuck Noll said he always liked to remember his Steelers as they were. And my feeling was that that's the way we should remember Chuck Noll, and that was my approach in doing the book. One day, I told you, people say to me, I wish I could go with you. There was a day this year in which I spent 2 hours in the morning in the office of Jack Ham, maybe the greatest linebacker in the history of pro football. Later in the afternoon, I rode around with Rocky Bleier as he was chauffeuring his teenage daughters to and fro at various school activities. 2 hours with Rocky Bleier, 2 hours with Jack Ham, and in between I was on the telephone with Terry Hanratty in New York and Art Rooney Jr. in West Palm Beach, Florida. And when I told that to Art Rooney Jr., he said, wow, he said, Hanratty and Bleier and Ham, that's quite a trifecta. And the thing is that I've never taken that opportunity for granted. I don't kneel, I don't genuflect when I'm around those people, but I do respect their achievements, and I feel that I want to tell their stories. In this Chuck Noll book, the two stars of the book are Art Rooney Jr., who I know is going to get in trouble with his brother Dan over this book, and Terry Hanratty, because Terry Hanratty nailed it. He said the most important person in the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers is Chuck Noll. That they were mostly mediocre for 40 years before he came along, and they've been mostly successful since he came to Pittsburgh and had a 23-year career as a coach. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned Paul Nassif. It's called Superman.
He could hit a softball. We had a lot of characters. I went to school with a fellow named Sudden Sam McDowell. And Sudden Sam was from Morningside, and he pitched a game when he was at Central Catholic in which all 16, at the time there were 16 major league teams, and all 16 teams had a scout at McGee Field in Greenfield. And Sam McDowell pitched a no-hitter, and he hit a home run to win the game 1-0. So that was quite a showing for Scots, for sure. Any other? Yes, Rich.
As we talked about this before, Jim, anyone here who hasn't read some of Jim's book, which are numerous, wants you to know that the way he writes, and buy that book, any member of your family, including your kids, because we all know football players, baseball players, and those of you the best thank you. I'll throw a word and you exclude that thing. So you can buy the book and be well aware of your kids can read without any problem.
I always tell people you can get my book for your local priest, and you won't have to worry about it. And that's a decision that I've made. And I'll tell you one of the things that prompted me to do that. It's not that I'm a fuddy-duddy or that I don't swear on occasion. It's just that I didn't want to disappoint anybody, especially at my church. I didn't want anybody reading it and going, oh. And I just didn't want to do it. And sometimes it's a real challenge because my wife said to me today, please, no more books. But there is a book that I want to do, and it involves Bob Prince. And Bob Prince just told more blues stories than anybody in the history of the city of Pittsburgh. And I have to figure out a way to capture his sense of humor without ruining my PG rating. But I take pride in the way I write. I was an English writing major at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm not a yunzer. I get upset with people that are careless with the language. I went to the University of Pittsburgh. It means something to me. Our current football coach, Paul Christ, my wife and I were in a car recently, and someone had told me that Paul Christ uses the phrase, you know, a lot. So we're riding in the car. It must have been a slow day. And we decided to count how many times Paul Christ says, you know. He had an 8-minute interview with Billy Hillgrove. And in 8 minutes, he said, you know, 48 times. So the next Saturday, we were in the car again. It just so happened here he was on again. And I said, let's count them again. And this time it was 64. 64 times in 8 minutes, the man said, you know. And to me, I don't care whether you're coaching gymnastics, football, swimming, or you're the biology teacher, if you are representing the University of Pittsburgh, you should learn how to speak. And I'll tell you who really does a good job. The pregame show that Bill Hillgrove does with Mike Tomlin. Mike Tomlin offers more information than Chuck Knoll or Bill Cowher offered. He's prepared. He has done his homework on the other team. And he uses some coach speak. He uses some words that he pulls out of left field. And someone recently told me that the people who make those decisions on the networks have Mike Tomlin on their target list as someone who, if he weren't coaching the Steelers, they would want to have as one of their talking heads. So that's kind of interesting. I just found that out about a week ago. Yes, sir. We better wrap it up because we do want to.
All right, I'll make it a short.
We have two things we have to do tonight. We have to get some books back there,
Since you mentioned Myron,
and we have to watch the Pirates later tonight.
since you mentioned Myron Coe calling Chuck Noll the Emperor, what did Chuck Noll actually feel about Myron Coe calling him the Emperor?
He just dismissed it. But he liked Myron. How could you not? And he would come over. I told you, he lived a half mile from Myron. And if Myron told him that the record player wasn't working, Chuck would come over to fix it. If you can picture that scene. And Myron said that one time they were in Cleveland, and he said they were staying in some hotel at the other end of town, and he never could understand why they stayed in this hotel. And something wasn't working. They had changed the telephones in the hotel, and they couldn't do the show back to Pittsburgh. And Chuck said, my sister lives around the corner. We'll go to her home, and we'll do the show. And that's when Myron realized that the reason they stayed at that hotel was so Chuck could be close to his sister's house in Cleveland. He looked after her. She lost her husband early in their marriage, and Chuck looked after her and her children quietly, but he was involved with them. And he's just a good man. And one of the things that struck me, and I remarked to my wife about this in doing this book, in going and interviewing people such as Elsie Greenwood and Rocky Bleier and Jack Ham and Mel Blount and Lynn Swan, I was struck by how profound their thoughts were and how well they expressed themselves about that. And he was sort of, for them, like the teacher you had in school that you may not have been thrilled about at the time, but later on in life you realized that that teacher had your best interest at heart and had been a big influence on your development and on what you turned out to be. And I think that's the story of Chuck Noll. But I think it also points up that they were a special breed of people. I don't duck any of the issues. Those Steelers of the 70s, many of them were on steroids. No one likes to accept that, but it's true. What was Noll's involvement? What was his feelings about that? And the other thing is, about 14 or 15 of those Steelers who were on the teams that won the 4 Super Bowls, about 14 or 15 of them, I'm not sure which number, have died before they reached the age of 60. And they are by far more ahead on that level than any of the teams in the National Football League. Nobody comes close to how many people died who were on that team. And of course you have to ask, why is that? What happened? And I deal with that in the book about Chuck Noll. But it's mostly because it's the kind of books that I write. It's a positive book. It's a tribute to Chuck Noll. It's a tribute to the Steelers organization. It's a tribute to the city of Pittsburgh. Listen, I want to thank you for coming out tonight. I had this thought that I was going to get here and there would be 5 people. And if there had been, Laverne, you were one of the first, I would have done the same thing that I did for 40 people. Because when you go out, you have to bring your best game. And I was honored to be the kickoff speaker, so to speak, for this town hall series of speaking that they're going to have. And I would urge you to support the program and to bring some friends the next time for the next speaker. And hopefully Maybe next year around this time they'll invite me back, but next year I'm going to say, listen, not in late September. Bring me back after the Pirates have won the World Series. Thank you very much for your time.